This is the pull starter off of that engine. Looks like it works okay. The fingers go in and out. I think I'll just clean it up and try to use it. I lost some of the video here when my battery goes dead. That's when I sprayed it with carburetor cleaner and brushed it off, and then blew it out with compressed air. And I'm going to spray WD-40 in there just to displace any of the carburetor cleaner that might be left. When this part is working properly, you can grab the outside here and rotate this, and the fingers should pop out when you go one way, and they pop back in when you go the other way. There's a spring in here that drags on this center hub and makes it move last. So when you're pulling on the rope, the larger diameter part moves with the rope, but the small diameter part is delayed. And that allows the fingers to move in and out. So that all looks like it's working properly. When you hold this up there and pull the rope, the fingers should pop out and grab the inside of that hub. I like to put these on with the handle towards the top. Well, that's not screwing in there. Alright, gotta clean the bolts and tap the holes. You might need to rotate the flywheel a bit, just to make sure the fin's not right behind the hole. A starter like this can be mounted in different positions, and I've seen them with the pull cord towards the front of the tractor. I like mine pointing towards the rear, so when I get done pulling it I can get to the throttle quickly, which is going to be near the dashboard. The mounting holes for this starter have a lot of clearance around the screws, and that's intentional so you can position the starter somewhat centered with the crankshaft. So there's a number of different ways to try to find this position. First, I'm going to pull on the starter and let the 3 fingers establish the position, and I'll try to tighten the bolts in the position that the starter tries to be naturally when you pull on it. Well, that didn't work that well. I can feel it slipping a tooth about every other time I pull it. So I'm going to retry that and use a different theory. This time I'm going to rotate the starter clockwise so that it's centered around the bolt holes. Seems like it wouldn't be the best way, because it's kind of locating on the housing, not the flywheel or the crankshaft. Hey, this little brass bushing's loose. I tightened that when I had it apart, but the rope is cut clear through it, so I'll bet the nut's never going to hold. Have to fix that later. Well, the starter's still skipping a tooth once in a while, so I'm going to take it apart and see if I can find something wrong. Well, I'm going to try to keep this round part from turning, and I'm going to push down on these fingers so they're in the inward position. And then what I see is these bottom 2, this one here and that one, protrude about 1/4 inch, but this one at the top only sticks out about 3/16 of an inch. So I'm going to get in there and take a look at that. There's a little spring in here. I'm not sure if that was hooked up. I don't remember feeling any spring action anywhere. This finger's been in farther than the other ones, so that's what I'll be taking a look at. First, I'm going to clean up all the parts. Each one of these fingers is sitting in a pocket, so they lift right out. I'm going to clean all this with carburetor cleaner. You can see this finger sticks in more than the other two. And it was bent with a lot of force because that metal is torn right there. So I'm going to try to put it back in position. That looks better. This piece is made of spring steel, and the fingers fit snugly over this other part so that when one turns against the other, it has some resistance. The small washer provides some clearance so the outer part can turn, while the big washer and the bolt hold it all in position and clamp that spring down to the housing. So that spring never moves. I want to put some grease in here before I put it together. These fingers need to go in so they're retracted. If you put them in backwards like that, they'll be sticking out too far. This little spring fits into this hole here, and I'm going to bend the loop on the spring so it's a little bit smaller. The other end of that spring hooks on the little round peg in the casting, and it needs to stay on there while you fish these fingers through the slots. I don't feel any spring pressure, so I think my spring came off. I got it that time. I can feel it trying to spring back. Alright, that all looks good. You can imagine that flat clutch spring clamp down in there, not moving. And it's providing resistance on this center section to make it turn last, and that's why the fingers pop out before they start rotating. If you look at the fingers now, they do stick out about the same. Alright, I think that'll work. I know this bushing here is bad, but I'm going to fix that after I make sure I don't hear a rod knocking or something. Well, first I'm going to position the starter using the fingers when I pull out on the rope. I'll tighten it up in that position. Well, that's not bad, but it missed a few times. So now I'm going to rotate the starter clockwise and tighten the bolts in that position. Well, that's as good as it's ever been. I'm going to leave it there. Next, I'm going to put the governor together. And here's the pieces. So I got to clean them. I'm going to degrease this stuff with carburetor cleaner. And I'm going to use the hand wire brush on these small parts. This spring fits in the bottom of the governor arm here, and that bent end of the spring goes up against the screw like that. So I'm going to get this screw started first. And then put the spring in place. When you get the screw tight, the spring should be mostly centered in that gap there. The coil in the spring should be in position so the shaft can go through the hole. The rounded end of the spring is going to fit in the slot like that when it goes together. This arm is clamped against the block when you tighten this brass piece. But this one's bent back so it interferes with the block when you turn it. So I'm going to go flatten that out, because you need to rotate that to adjust it. This other end is not flat either, so I'm going to fix that too. And now that fits behind there, and I can rotate it around without the block interfering. The next thing that goes on is the round disc, and I have to remove this brass bushing to get it on there. Leave that washer on the shaft so you don't lose it. When it's finally assembled, the disc is fairly close to the block with only this arm in between them. So the next thing I worry about is if there's enough clearance where the cable connects. You can see the arm on the disc gets fairly close to this valve cover, so I'm going to bend it out a little bit so I have some clearance there. I like plenty of clearance there because the Z-bend in your throttle cable goes through that hole, sticks out the other side, and might hit the valve cover. Here the brass bushing goes through the disc, and the arm goes in behind it. Position the arm where you want it, and then tighten the brass bushing. Now the arm should be clamped to the block, but that disc should rotate freely. The position of the arm will have to be adjusted later when the throttle cable is attached. Next I'm going to put the big arm on there. You got to make sure the rounded end of this spring goes in that slot. It looks like there's a lot of in-play in that shaft there. That little washer inside does affect that, but we know that was in place. So I might need to adjust that in-play later when I go into the governor adjustment process. Now I got to take the arm back off to get this upper linkage attached. Each end of this linkage is a little bit different. I like to use the Z-bend end on the carburetor side. To start out, I use the innermost hole on the throttle arm, and I use the lower hole on the governor arm. You can move that linkage to a different hole after you find out how the governor reacts when the engine's running. You might have to tighten the nut and bolt so the arm grips the shaft, but you should be able to put it on here and rotate this disc and move the throttle lever with hardly any effort. Make sure there's no binding going on anywhere. Don't forget this spring has to be in this slot here. If you use more pressure to move the disc, you can see how the spring works. Now the governor should work, but it still needs to be adjusted. And the pull starter works. Well, that's as far as I'm going this time, and here's what it looks like. Alright, that's it.